As early as last year, Go Air, which rebranded to GoFirst, was planning an initial public offering. It's now voluntarily filed for insolvency protection. What's going on? And why do airlines go bust? I'm Varsha Meghani and you're watching Nuts and Bolts by Forbes India. GoFirst blamed failing Pratt & Whitney engines for grounding about half its fleet of Airbus aircraft.
At this point, Go's future remains uncertain. It could get acquired or land up in India's airline graveyard, just like Damania Airways, East-West Airlines, ModiLuft, the Khemka family-owned NEPC, and the government-owned Vayudoot, which went out of business in the post-liberalisation 1990s. In the early 2000s, Air Sahara, Air Deccan, and Chennai-based Paramount Airways collapsed. And in the last decade, we've seen Kingfisher Airlines, Air Costa and Jet Airways go bankrupt.
Even SpiceJet, although not bankrupt, is financially beleaguered, while the perennially loss-making Air India was sold to the Tatas last year. So why do high-profile airlines keep failing? The reason for airline failures vary, but it mostly boils down to a mix of dirt-cheap airfares, high taxes on jet fuel, demand shocks, and the depreciating rupee. Competition is intense in India's aviation sector, so airlines offer ultra-cheap fares to woo customers. The cheapest one-way ticket for a 90-minute flight from Mumbai to Delhi, for example, was offered for 10,000 rupees on MakeMyTrip.com on May 10th, compared with 17,000 rupees for a similar length flight from New York to Atlanta. Bigger players like Indigo are able to recoup their costs on less competitive routes and can even tap into economies of scale to lower overheads. Smaller players aren't able to do that. Jet fuel is an airline's single biggest cost, accounting for more than half the expenses for some no-frills brands. It doesn't help that some states slap a value-added tax of as much as 30% on jet fuel. External events like the 9/11 terrorist attacks or more recently the COVID-19 pandemic dry up demand for air travel. But carriers still have to shell out money on fixed costs like the leasing of airplanes. The Indian rupee has fallen almost 20% against the dollar since the beginning of 2019, making it more expensive to lease planes from abroad. Finally, it boils down to how you manage your business and these competing factors. Indigo, for example, also faced issues with its Pratt & Whitney engines, but came out of it relatively unscathed, while Go has floundered. It's not for nothing that Richard Branson, the founder of the Virgin Group, once said, "If you want to be a millionaire, start with $1 billion and launch an airline." Airlines keep popping up because the opportunity is massive. India is now the largest population in the world, with a rising middle class and rising aspirations to match. People want to travel. On April 30th, for example, India's domestic air traffic hit a record high, with more than 4.5 lakh passengers flying on a single day, as almost 3,000 flights took off across the country. India's Civil Aviation Minister, Jyotiraditya Scindia, said in a tweet, "The skyrocketing domestic passenger traffic post-COVID is a reflection of India's high growth." More than 37.5 million passengers were carried by domestic airlines in just the first 3 months of 2023, marking a 51.7% increase compared to a year ago, according to India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation. And while there has been a significant increase in the number of first-time flyers since the pandemic, barely 2 to 3% of India's population actually flies. If airlines can switch even 0.1% of those people from trains to planes, you're talking lakhs of people. And that is the lure of the business. Which explains why Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, the now deceased billionaire, invested in Air Sahara, which launched last year. The government has helped in the past. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the government introduced an emergency credit guarantee scheme, which required banks to loan money to pandemic-hit businesses to help them stay afloat. The government would repay banks in case of a default. Go dipped into this fund, but now that the pandemic has passed, airlines aren't necessarily looking for capital, at least not the bigger ones. Instead, what they are looking for is a conducive environment to do business. The government can help with that by easing procedures and regulations, or building airports, which will help improve connectivity. It's also now focused on privatizing airports and investing the proceeds in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. It can also urge states to reduce taxes. But that's a matter that falls under the purview of the Ministry of Finance, not the Civil Aviation Ministry. Any changes to the tax structure need to be ratified by the Parliament, and that's not easy to do. The market seems to be maturing in that we now have two major players: the well-capitalized Tata Group, which owns Air India, a full-service carrier, and Air Asia, a low-cost offshoot, and Indigo, a 300-plus aircraft business with a proven track record of running an efficient airline. While they'll continue to expand and grow, the problem lies for everyone else. How do they compete with these two behemoths? According to Vinamra Longani, an aviation analyst,
unless Akasa expands aggressively and inducts a sizable number of aircraft, or SpiceJet, for that matter, is able to grow once again, we may end up with a duopoly of sorts for all practical purposes, whereby these airlines, for instance, the Tata Group Airlines and Indigo, may be able to charge significantly more for travel.
So until a reasonably well-capitalized player comes along, expect to pay a little bit more for your airline tickets.